Hello.
Hi, everyone. This is Empowering Democracy. Our topic for tonight is the 2022 midterm election preview. I'm your host, Joe Firestone, and I'm here with Ezra Wilson, who
Hello.
has been our elections expert on this show for some time and who has a lot to say about the midterms that have been ongoing since people have been voting for some time. Uh, the midterms that end on November 8th, except, of course, for the post election disputes and shouting and legal challenges,
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
which are likely to happen this time. Uh, okay, so what we want to talk about here today, okay, is what Ezra thinks has happened since last week in these races, and but to what extent he thinks that the articles in the press about how the Republicans have really gained a lot, whether that is true, if there are any trends with respect to Democrats coming back. We're going to talk about also specific races, especially the races for the Senate. Uh, and we're going to have a whole lot of fun talking about that stuff. Okay, because I think we're all really, really interested in what is actually going on. So, Ezra, what do you see are the main trends right now?
So I think that for the first real time during the election season that I can think of, Republicans are certainly gaining in the Senate more than they are in the House. And it seems less reflective of the Biden administration. Certainly, I can't say that, you can't point at the polls and necessarily indicate what are all the causes of this trend. But overall, Joe Biden's popularity over the past week, his approval ratings really haven't changed. His disapprovals have gone up about half a point or so, if I recall. Um, Meanwhile, the overall support for him is sort of baselined, and the support for Democrats in the House has also sort of started to flatline. It's gaining a little bit, like we talked about, but nowhere near as much as Republicans. So from September, right, the end of September, right, and Republicans first started getting a wave, Democrats still had a 1.3 lead in the generic ballot polls. So Democrats had 45.4% of the polls support in the polls, and Republicans had 4% or so, or 44% rather. That has certainly changed to actually be the opposite lead. So Republicans now have a 1.3% lead in the generic ballot polls, which tend to skew a little more Democratic, though I'm not sure they're going to as much this year. So right now, Republicans actually, so you'll see from that time period, Democratic support really hasn't changed, just dropped from 45.3% to 45.2% from September 30th. But Republican support has gone from the 44.1 I mentioned to 46.4%. So Republicans have almost increased their support by over 2%, according to generic ballot polling of registered voters, right? Or likely registered voters, rather, sorry. Which is sort of interesting to me because quite often, you see a little bit of a balance. Granted, closer to election, right? A lot of those undecideds are becoming non-undecided. So it makes sense to see a little bit of growth for both parties, I suppose. But it's very interesting that Democrats have flatlined essentially over the past month, over the 5 weeks especially, while Republicans have seen quite a large growth in terms of um, generic ballot support. And we've seen in the polling that the polling sort of indicates that Georgia and Pennsylvania might be moving back towards the toss-up tilt Democratic area. And Arizona might be moving from where it could have been a likely lead for Mark Kelly to sort of being more competitive, at least according to the polls. And I do find that a little interesting. And also, as expected, Ohio has sort of pushed out of what I think is any reasonable chance for Tim Ryan to really win, which has sort of been what I've been talking about for quite a while and pretty much the whole election cycle, is that race, to me, I think there is a small chance Tim Ryan could do well, but or could win. But at the same time, I think that is a lot more like Democrats investing in the Ohio race last cycle, for example, where they really didn't have a chance. They were just kind of throwing a lot of money at a decent candidate in a swing state and just trying to adjust my camera. And it really didn't yield any results, despite the fact that polls indicated that Democrats were going to flip a lot more states than they did, if that makes sense.
Well, let me ask some questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So, the views I've had, okay, of the generic ballot are that it generally underestimates the support of the Republicans because, due to voter suppression and gerrymandering and stuff like that, they always get a boost over what they poll on the generic ballot. In fact, I've heard it said, I've read articles over a period of time for years now, that because of the voter suppression and gerrymandering, the Republicans have a built-in 6 to 7 point lead in the House, which Democrats always have to overcome. So if you're saying the latest polling on the generic ballot shows the Republicans have a lead of a point or something like that, that suggests that the Republicans are likely to win the House by 8 points. And that's enough of a landslide that it's, going to shoot the Democrats out of the water.
Yeah.
What do you think of that analysis?
I definitely see that analysis. At the same time, I think that this year's going to be a little different, maybe just because redistricting, Democrats usually do have to overcome, I don't know, 7 points sounds a little high. I might put it more 4, 5, maybe 6%. In terms of the Republicans, because of voter suppression and gerrymandering, being able to win with a lot less percent of the popular vote. So typically for Democrats to even have a chance at winning the House or just nationwide, they have to be doing better than Republicans by by at least a few percent in the popular vote, right? And so I agree with that. I don't think that has as much effect this year because, I don't know a good way to put it, because I think that the polls, one, haven't quite adjusted for all of the many factors that have been evolving throughout this election cycle. And I also think that there's a lot more, there's not necessarily a strong national way that any sort of group of that voters broadly seem to be feeling. In 2016, it was there was a lot of resentment towards neoliberalism. There was a lot of rise of right-wing populism. And in 2018, it sort of flipped. It was a lot of anti-Trump. We don't want a radical right-winger who says and does mean things type of thing, right? So often there's sort of a broad message of voters across the country. And while I think there is still some in terms of people sort of, again, not liking sort of the neoliberal establishment or the Joe Biden administration, certainly, I don't think that is influencing voters quite as much. Or I don't think that is as much of like I don't think 2022 is going to be as much of a referendum on Biden as 2018 was on Trump. And so I really don't think that like, I don't know how to word it. I don't think Republicans are going to do as well as like people think. I don't think they're going to get that 6 to 8% nationwide lead. And I don't think that the polls, national polls, represent all areas, because there are certainly areas Democrats are doing a lot better than they have in the past, and areas where Republicans are doing a lot better. So we look at Oregon, where Republicans have a chance of winning the governor's race, although I think that's slipping from my understanding. And they have a chance at potentially flipping some House seats there. And they also, in New York, right, have a chance of winning more competitive seats, and they have a chance of not a chance really, but they have a chance to make the governor's race more competitive than it should be, right? Whereas Democrats have Oklahoma, the governor race in Oklahoma, at like a 5-point lead for Republicans. And Democrats seem to be doing really well in early ballots, particularly in Southern California, right? Compared to usual. Or, you know, like it seems to me that there are a lot of regions that are sort of different, like in terms of more, it's not, I'm trying to think of the word, aren't swinging as much the way the national way is. Like they're not as tied to sort of this national picture of how Republicans or independents or Democrats are feeling. And it's a lot more regional based than a lot of elections, if that makes sense. But
Yeah, but let me ask further. What do you think of the way the pollsters have constituted their samples this year? In other words, did they are the samples they've used for polling, do they really reflect the underlying populations?
I think it depends. So a lot of polls this year, and you'll probably see a lot of articles about it, or a lot of people talking about it online, have been very all over the place in terms of their methodology. There's no real consensus for some reason on using registered versus likely. A lot of polls are using registered voters, which don't always really translate to likely voters. And that's been one reason why in the past Democrats have done better in polling, is because polls, a lot of companies will rely on registered voters, which doesn't really give you an idea of how people are actually going to vote, because there are plenty of people that aren't registered to vote up until the month before the election, depending on, you know, or the day of the election, depending. And a lot of people, I don't know, things like that. I think a lot of the polls have also had really low sample sizes this year. I'm not entirely sure what that's about. Maybe just cost saving. A lot of companies, certainly not all companies, you know, Morning Consult, Data for Progress, YouGov, many of those have had pretty strong number of people polled in their polls. But certainly a lot of these lower ballot races, race specific polls, have been 200, maybe 500, which can be fine sometimes, but like 200, 300 people in the poll, which isn't really representative, right? And it still seems like companies have results all over the place. So if we point out, what's a good race? The Georgia race, actually, those polls that came in today. Yeah, so the polls, the past 6 polls, so from this past week, have shown Warnock with a 1% lead, a 6% lead, but have also shown Herschel Walker with a 2% lead or a 7% lead. Like they're all over the place. There's not, even from generally high rated polling companies, there doesn't always seem to be a real consensus on likely versus registered voters or what demographics are represented. Certainly, you know, it remains to be seen how many women are going to register to vote or really come out to vote as opposed to usual because of the Dobbs decision, or, you know, how many, trying to think of other groups, but like certainly there are younger voters, there you go, are actually going to come out and vote, because there have been times where younger voters, people think they're going to come out, so they sort of put them more in polls, which helps Democrats, and then they don't really show up on election day. But certainly, so my assumption is a lot of polls seem to sort of underdo younger voters in terms of underrepresenting them, with the idea that they're really not going to end up turning out. And this year we've seen higher numbers of younger people registered to vote. Anecdotally, I could point out to the fact that a lot more people are getting energized to vote at younger ages. And I expect that that's going to have a bigger influence on this election than it has in the past, and probably be probably going to shift what the election day demographics are from what the polling demographics are. And certain companies sort of seem to be trying to get to that factor, and other companies seem to just be way potentially underdoing how many young voters are going to come out. So Yeah.
Okay, so this kind of stuff would affect the consensus of the polls
Mm-hmm.
and would throw off the polling consensus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sort of just the way I just described that Georgia race, where all in the same week polls, relatively well rated polls have had Warnock winning Georgia at 7 points or 6 points, while having Walker win Georgia at 7 points. Just because of how different the methodologies can be, or whether they use likely or registered or things like that.
So right now, the pollsters aren't really providing a basis for saying that the winner in Georgia is going to be Walker or the winner in Georgia is going to be Warnock.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, the last week, right? Um, just how wild the polls have been. It moved from a Warnock +3 race on 538 to being like a split even race, which I just think is interesting in terms of showing that the polls are sort of all over the place.
Yeah, I think that's interesting too.
I think it can show a little bit of a trend, right? I think the scandals that Walker's had are starting to fade out, and maybe with the recession or the fears of an impending recession again, right? That there's going to be more resentment towards Democrats who are in lead. So I can understand, right, that Walker and Oz and Blake Masters are all going to be doing a little bit better in the polls. So like polls, I think, do well at showing sort of trends, but then you never know if the numbers are quite right just because of how wild all these polls can be. I don't know.
Yeah, right. And you don't know if the trends are right if different pollsters are predicting different trends.
Yeah.
In other words, it sounds like some pollsters are going one way in Georgia in terms of a trend,
Yeah.
and other pollsters are going another way in
Yeah.
terms of a trend. So when you get that, it's very hard to balance it off. You have to make judgments about.
Yeah. Though I will say, right, you can sort of aggregating polls, I don't always think is good in terms of trying to estimate who has what share of the vote. But I would say generally aggregating polls can be good at understanding trends, right? So taking the data points of each of them, saying, okay, on average, Democrats have moved or Republicans have done 2% better in this race over
Yeah,
the last month. And I think that can give you an idea, even if all the numbers aren't right and the methodologies are a little skewed, still aggregating the average over time generally is pretty good at giving you an idea of how a race is trending, at least in my experience. But
yes, I think that's right. But in this case, when the pollsters are all over the place,
mm-hmm.
and there seems a bifurcation in what they think,
Yeah.
then that would make the aggregates less representative of the whole. Okay, because the average in that sort of situation will not mean as much in terms of identifying the trend.
Mm.
Uh, yeah, I think that's the way I wanted to put it.
Mm-hmm. No, I get that.
Yeah. Uh, okay, let's see if we can get into the individual races and if that can tend to clarify things for us. Uh, should we go through certain key House races at this point?
Um, yeah, if you want to.
Uh,
The thing at house races at this point is it's kind of harder to tell. We have the fundraising numbers that we have. We can tell when scandals happen, but it's a little short window between the election for much to be popping up, I think. And there's not many polls on house races, but certainly we can go over some of them. So I don't know how much has really changed from last week in many of these races, but I would say overall, though, that Democrats, I think, are starting to do better in the House relative to what they used to be doing. And we've already talked about this, where they've sort of been able to really start performing well in some races that would have been out of the picture a year or two ago, right? That Alaska race in particular with Mary Patola, she's pretty much guaranteed to be reelected, right? And even in a lot of these swing districts, fundraising and polling and debate performances and things like that seem to be showing some pretty good numbers for Democrats, as well as mail-in votes. So we talked last week a lot about Southern California and how the Democrats there were doing really, really well, right? And in races like Chris DeLuzio's race, we've seen some good fundraising and ads from his campaign. And Michelle Vallejo, she's in a really good spot. Bernie came out and did a campaign event for her the other day. She seems to be having a lot of momentum, a lot of volunteers, a lot of money. She was able to. We did talk about this, right?
We did talk about
I
this.
told you about the fundraising. So there was another fundraising period, right? In between, there was the quarterly reports at the end of September, right?
Yes.
And then the first 2 weeks of October or something like that, October 1st to like the 16th. It might depend on states. There is
the fundraising was going well for her.
There's the pre-election fundraising that is like a 2-week period before early voting starts, or usually up to when early voting starts. That campaigns show their money. And I don't know if we talked about it on the show, but Henry Cuellar and Vicente Gonzalez, the two blue dogs in Southern Texas,
yes,
both were absolutely wiped out in terms of fundraising by the Republican opponents. But Michelle Vallejo was actually able to outraise her opponent by a little bit, which was very interesting, from the fact that she is a grassroots campaign. The other two have a lot of big money donors. And certainly Republicans.
Is there a chance Henry Cuellar could lose?
I don't really think. I think Henry Cuellar has a very enthusiastic base of certain groups of people that are going to come out and vote for him. For some reason, there are people dead set on Henry Cuellar, right? And I don't think he's going to lose. I think the one to look at is Vicente Gonzalez, even though that was a district Biden won by like 15 points or something like that. Gonzalez has had a few. Gonzalez actually isn't from the district. He's from Texas 15th, but he carpetbagged because it was easier re-election, right?
Yeah, he thought it would be easy.
And the legislature conveniently just plugged his neighborhood into the 34th district, probably to incentivize him to run there, which is interesting. And then he did run there, and really most of that district isn't his territory, right? And Maya Flores is the Republican he's running against, actually won the special election there because Democrats didn't put any energy to it. So she's been running a campaign. She ran in 2020. She's more well established. She's technically an incumbent too, which probably provides some advantage. Certainly, we see that with Mary Patola, different race, but could provide some advantage. And Henry Cuellar is an incumbent from a different region, and I think Maya Flores is a really good attack on him for just sort of carpetbagging out of political convenience. And that, with the fundraising numbers and the polling, seems to be showing that race could potentially flip, right? Even though it's one of those geographical things I was talking about, where some of these races are very out of the national average.
Yes.
And Republicans could win a district that Biden won by 15 points. At the same time, that Michelle Vallejo could win a race that Trump won by like 1%. And those are neighboring districts. But very interesting nonetheless, how that sort of dynamic is going on right now.
To hop around a little, I've been noticing Jamie McLeod Skinner has been sending out a lot of emails to fundraise. How do you think she's doing?
Overall, I think Jamie's a really strong campaigner. I don't think she's gonna lose. I just don't see it happening. The way the district is, the way she is as a candidate, her history running, particularly in Kent County, which is the competitive, or not Kent County, what's the other one? I don't remember. Deschutes. Running in the very competitive region of that district in the past, and the way she did pretty well for a grassroots candidate in the primary, and was doing, she's got a very well established campaign. And I just don't think the Republican has it there. That being said, those neighboring races, I think Democrats are still going to hold on to the 4th district. It's just going to be a lot more competitive than they thought, and the same with the 6th district, which really shouldn't be that competitive either. But certainly seems like it's going to be. If not, Republicans could even hypothetically win that district. Although I think Salini's had a pretty good fundraising number. And we really haven't seen any polls since October 5th, which Democrats were in a little bit of a worse place, if I recall correctly.
Okay, so also shifting around more, okay, an inevitable question. Is Katie Porter really in trouble?
Katie Porter's not. Mike Levin is the only sort of incumbent in that region, incumbent Democrat that has anything to worry about. And even then, I'm cautious of any time a Republican says that they're going to win that district. And, mail-in ballots last week were looking really good for both Katie, especially for Katie Porter, but pretty good for Mike Levin as well. Okay. And I haven't seen updated numbers, but if that holds true, which I expect it to still be pretty good for them. I think both are going to win. I would say the only thing Democrats really have to worry about is Valeto's district. Rudy Salas, one of the only 2 new blue dogs that are running this year, is running against Valeto in the 22nd district. It's a likely Biden district. Democrats should be winning it. Everyone kind of thought Democrats were winning it. Then these mail-in ballots start coming in, and we see he's only ahead in mail-in ballots by like 1%. In a race, you'd probably expect him to be a lot more. And it's a bluer district, much bluer than Katie Porter or Mike Levin's district, but yet the Democrat seems to be performing dramatically worse, which I think is interesting. But
there's no reason you can put your finger on.
I think he's just not a great candidate. I think he was overhyped. I think Brian Osorio, who was a local mayor, progressive, should have been in that race. He was doing really well. People really liked him. And then Rudy Salas came in, and everyone was like, oh, this is going to be a great candidate, speaks to the district. And so Brian Osorio went into a state Senate race. And the race kind of just cleared up for Rudy Salas. And we'll see. I just don't really think he's that great of a candidate. I don't think blue dogs always have that strong of a message. And I think that goes without saying. But and if polling is starting to show, or if mail-ins and stuff are starting to show that Democrats aren't doing really well there, I just think that's really interesting. I don't know.
Okay, so you're saying Democrats, the mail-in ballots are showing Democrats are not doing very well.
Well, Democrats aren't doing as well there as they are in other regions. They probably shouldn't be doing that. So that last time I checked, the mail-in disparity there was Democrats were ahead in that district by 1%. That district should, in theory, be bluer than Katie Porter district or Mike Levin's district by a decent bit, or by California's 27th district, which is the Mike Garcia and Christy Smith race. Yet it is dramatically lower in terms of Democrats having Democratic lead over Republicans in those early votes. So, yeah.
Okay. So let's get to the Summerlee race. But you've already said that you don't think AIPAC's going to get her.
I don't think so. I just don't see it happening. The DCCC did do a poll of this race the last 2 days of October, so Halloween and Halloween Eve. And those the poll of 785 likely voters, which is pretty good polling metric for a House race. That's a lot more voters than we see in a lot of other House races. Summerlee she got 54% of the vote to Mike Doyle, not the incumbent Democrat, but the Republican candidate.
The Republican Mike Doyle, yeah.
Right, yeah.
The imposter.
Yeah, exactly. He got 40% of the vote. So Summerlee with a 14% lead shows it's not going to switch this year. It's not going to flip. Certainly with AIPAC putting money in, progressives are going to be looking more at that race. They're going to be like, okay, let's just throw some more money in here just in case. Let's, make sure, let's not sleep on this race, right? And I think overall,
which probably will work to the benefit of Summerlee, actually.
Well, yeah, exactly. So I think that overall, I think APAC doing this is putting more attention on the race, which is going to let some really bounce back if it were competitive, but it's really not competitive anyway.
Okay, and with Chris Deluzio's race, that's
Um,
going along smoothly.
yeah, I haven't really seen any updates on that, but my assumption is it's going well there still. Chris is a good candidate. I really haven't seen anything that suggests the race is going to turn out bad. Yeah.
Maybe this should be our segue to move to the Senate.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to, yeah. I think it's good actually. Just double checking.
Would you like to say more about the House before we shift?
I was curious about something. No, I was just checking a poll, but never mind. There hasn't really been anything new in polls, other than I would say that I think Democratic incumbents in some areas are starting to do better than they were doing, but I think we talked about that a little bit already. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, a little bit.
Steve, Steve says he sees a red tsunami. I mean, I think it's possible. I just don't see there being as much Republican support as there usually is, right? I'm not seeing as much enthusiasm, as much not that Republicans really rely on grassroots donations, but certainly these fundraising numbers were pretty poor for Republicans. Their candidates have been pretty scandal plagued. Biden's disapproval isn't rising through the roof in this last home stretch. And Democratic support really isn't going down. It's just Republican support going up. If I saw both, I might be more lenient towards saying that. And I just think the way that these races are, and the fact that Democrats have been able to secure races that they really shouldn't have, like the Alaska race, I think that is putting them in a decent enough position to block what should hypothetically be, or what would usually be, a Republican midterm, or anti-presidential midterm election like we saw in 2010 or 2018, if that makes sense. But
that does make sense, yes. Going back, though, to specifics in terms of the Senate races, the press is saying that the Fetterman Oz race is closing.
mm.
Is that true?
I mean, yeah, I think the debate performance negatively impacted Fetterman, and I think it maybe provided some people on the right with more hope that Oz was going to do better, right? If Fetterman had a poor debate performance, and I'm sure that probably meant more money, more enthusiasm, more ad buys, whatever, for Oz. And so since the debate, we have basically seen that Fetterman's lead went down from about the 2 points we talked about last week on average in the polls to being a negligible lead. It's a 0.03% lead right now, on 538 in terms of polling average. That being said, Oz's lead in any polls that he does lead in is very weak. It's the polls that show Oz winning are quite often more of the less reputable polling companies. They're still reputable, but they're ones more prone to error than some of these other ones that show Fetterman in the lead, right? So Fetterman's winning the USA Today, Suffolk's poll, the Fox News poll, they're tied in the Morning Call poll, and Oz is only winning by 1% in the Emerson poll. But what's skewing the average a bit more are some of these lesser known polls, usually with less sample size, that have Oz 1 to 3 points in the lead, or like Insider Advantage, companies like that, or Coefficient that had Oz 3 points the other day, and so like I think the average right now, and so the idea that Oz is taking the lead is a little skewed, because I don't think that those are always the best polls, and the better polls are still showing Fetterman with a 2 to 3% lead, many of them at least, or at least an even race. So I don't know. I still think Fetterman has a way to bounce back, just because overall his campaign has been really good, right? relative to a lot of swing state Democrats and certainly relative to Oz's. So, as he recovers.
When you factor in the ground game
Mhm,
here and the importance of the ground game
mhm,
when it comes to election day,
mhm.
isn't that an area where Fetterman has a big lead over Oz?
Yeah, I'm starting to wonder though sometimes how effective the ground game is becoming in races, although that's maybe more of a testament to Democratic primaries and general elections, which remains to be seen, I think, a little bit. Um, but yeah, I think Fetterman certainly has more energy behind his campaign. I think he has um, a much stronger grassroots campaign and much more support. And I think that that's going to allow for more enthusiasm going into election day, and mixed out with the fact that Chris DeLuzio and Matt Cartwright are seeming to do pretty well relative in their House races, and maybe same as Susan Wild. So those swing races
Yeah.
are getting more solidified for Democrats. And the governor's race, where the Democratic candidate is doing much better. I think overall Democrats just have good enthusiasm and a good base in Pennsylvania this year, that I think is probably going to end up helping out Fetterman once we
have
get.
we got a weather forecast for Tuesday?
I actually don't even know. I mean, that's going to depend on the country, all over the country. But I'll just check Pittsburgh just to see.
But those are situations in which the stronger gang,
Yeah, I mean, certainly weather can be an impact on election day voting, and we've seen that in the past. It doesn't look like, I don't think there's really going to be much of storms on Tuesday anywhere. I know the weekend's supposed to be a little bit of a storm in the Northeast, but it looks like election day weather is pretty okay. So I wouldn't expect it to be anything that bad.
Okay, so Georgia, is looking like a toss-up at this time.
It's looking more like that. I would have to do more research into really what's going on there, because I still feel like the fact that it's a toss-up just seems weird to me, given what I've been seeing about the race. But the polls at least show a pretty dramatic dip in the past week and a half. So from October 25th, where Warnock had a 3-point lead, to Warnock suddenly dropping 1.5% in the polls, and Walker rising about 1.5% in the polls. And I don't necessarily know. I would say part of that is definitely skewed. So I will say this. I don't know how 538 is factoring into these polls, but the Echelon Insights, which is a very low. So for a statewide race, they have 500 voters, which is very low in terms of
too little.
Yeah, and they're a fairly new established polling company. So they did a couple of polls in 2020, and I don't really know if they've done much before then as a polling company. And their polls right now have Walker at 4 to 7% lead, which seems just way out of the realm of possibility to me. So I think the averages are skewed by that, and as well as the internal poll that Herschel Walker did from More Informations, which is a GOP polling firm that has him at 5-point lead, right? I just think that that's wrong, right? Certainly, I mean, I think some of these polls that suggest a closer race, like the Emerson College, the Fox News polls that are a lot more reputable, still show Walker at a 1 to 2% lead. And I do think that he probably has a bit more room for improvement over the next stretch, because I just don't really see Herschel Walker being able to solidify a strong message or incentive to get out and vote, especially if any more scandals happen or if anything worse gets out in the next week, or less than a week now.
Right. Will the race be affected by greater Republican control over the election machinery?
Yeah, that is certainly an issue in Georgia, just broadly, pretty much every election cycle. And I think that's going to be a factor in this one. And I don't necessarily know all the ways that polls are handling that. At the same time, I think especially Stacey Abrams and sort of that 2020 voter turnout, voter registration that Democrats were able to do was incredibly effective in helping them do better in the state.
Yes.
And Warnock was a big part of that, right? Warnock Ossoff's campaigns last cycle. And I think that those campaigns have the equipment, and I'm sure that he's probably working very closely with Ossoff as well. And Stacey Abrams and people like that, that I think he's going to be able to drive out turnout still and keep people registered or help minimize voter suppression in Georgia. But yeah, I guess that does remain to be seen. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, to Ohio. I just saw a tough piece in Politico today on Tim Ryan
Mm-hmm.
singing the praises of Tim Ryan
Mm-hmm.
as a fighting candidate who talks the language, okay, of working people
Mm-hmm.
who in Ohio are, disillusioned with Democrats,
Mm-hmm.
but who think that Tim Ryan is their kind of candidate because he's a fighter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically the theme of the article. Uh, in that article, they have a number of photos, okay, of Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
He looks like he's in great shape. Uh, he's dressed in clothes that seem to be more in line with the working man.
Mm-hmm.
He seems like he's extremely friendly with the people that he's talking to.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, okay, I see this as a puff piece, but on the other hand, why did Politico do it? They don't have a particular bias towards Democrats, do they?
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
Okay, so the point I'm raising is the polls do show that the two sides, J.D. Vance, okay, and Tim Ryan, are very close in the polls.
Uh,
Polls, it's a toss-up.
Actually, I would agree. Mostly, the polls have been pretty well for Tim Ryan in terms of making it a toss-up race. We did see the past. There's been a lot less polling on this in the past than some of the other races. So since last week, we've actually only seen 3 polls, I want to say, come out, and all of them had Vance at 5% from 2 different companies during 3 different periods. So back-to-back polls, the 28th to 29th and the 29th to November 1st, and the one that came out today or yesterday. They did all have Vance in 5th place, and those are from, huh?
How are the polling companies involved? Are they good polling companies?
I mean, Remington is the one that I think is skewing more towards Republicans in a lot of these races. They had the Warnock poll at 4%, so I'm a little cautious of that one. But the Signal polling company is usually pretty accurate relative to a lot of other polling companies. They did likely voters. They had very high turnout in both their polls, over 1,500, which is pretty good for a polling company. And historically, they get about 95% of the races they poll correct in the final election polls. And so I think that sort of is representative of the fact that perhaps J.D. Vance is starting to do better, right? They had J.D. Vance polling at just 3.5% or something like that a week ago, and then 3% a week before then, and now their poll shows them at 5%. So their poll seems to definitely be showing a trend that I would sort of say is pretty reasonable, in that J.D. Vance seems to be doing better. Or maybe that Tim Ryan hit his base for a Democrat in Ohio.
who isn't Sherrod Brown. And I think in some ways he's mimicked Sherrod Brown's campaign well in being a very appealable working class candidate. Certainly much more growth than we saw as the very very unsuccessful presidential candidate. And but I don't think he has the policy rhetoric that Sherrod Brown has. I don't think he has the same energy. He's had points where Democrats have come out and really denounced rather some of his rhetoric in his campaign, specifically on China or immigration or things like that, where his wording has just come off as xenophobic. And I think that has hurt Democratic momentum with him. I don't know. And I just think he doesn't have quite the same policy. I don't think he's as poised on policy as Sherrod Brown is, and as agreeable on it either. Where he seems to be doing the playbook of just run conservatives on certain issues in a swing state and hope that Republicans are going to vote for you over the Republican, which hasn't really worked. Democrats try that a lot in Ohio. Sherrod Brown ran on a different type of campaign, and that's why he's so beloved in the state. Or that's, one of the reasons. So ultimately, I would agree with the polls in the sense that the race is trending more towards J.D. Vance, as the undecideds just don't really have much reason to go with Ryan over Vance. Reading what I'm saying.
Okay, very good. How about Sherry Beasley in North Carolina? Has she any chance?
Of all the swing races, North Carolina has just been the one I really haven't paid as much attention to throughout the entire election cycle. I have heard, though, that Beasley is doing better. The fundraising was pretty decent. Her polling numbers have gone up about a percent point over the past several days. Before that, she'd pretty much flatlined at about 43% throughout the entire election cycle. That being said, Bud still has risen a little bit as well. So there's still a 4-point lead there almost for Republicans in the polling. Ultimately, I could definitely see this being one of those races where the polls aren't really skewed towards Democrats. And we see Ted Budd wins by 3 to 6% or something like that. But we're seeing some more polls, right, where Sherry Beasley is doing better, or even making it even in the Civics poll, although Civics is a little questionable as a company sometimes, and had low voter turnout in the polls.
Okay, could there be a hidden effect from the pollsters in North Carolina of the Dobbs decision?
I mean, yeah, certainly. That is always an issue with polls, especially this cycle, is determining the turnout in women and younger voters because of these issues, or just independents or pro-life Republicans or things like that. People that might not be voting, might be coming out to vote more than usual, or might not be voting Republican because of this issue in particular. At the same time, I do think Dobbs is sort of starting to disappear from people's minds as we worry about a recession, as inflation got really high, then started to drop.
As we worry about a war.
About it, as war continues to escalate. And so I do unfortunately think that it's sort of starting to drop, especially outside of liberal circles, in terms of importance in the election. I don't think that that's true everywhere. I think certainly, a driving factor in a lot of places is abortion. I know Vermont, that is a very heavy part of campaigns right now, but Vermont is also unique in the aspect that we have abortion on our ballot, and pretty safe Democrat in most races. So people maybe aren't as focused on beating Republicans, and might be more, I don't know, but.
Okay, this may be a little off the wall, but does Charlie Booker in Kentucky have any shot at it?
No. Neither him nor Gary Chambers, unfortunately. I do actually think Gary Chambers is going to do better than expected. Charles Booker, I thought, was for a while. ultimately, I think that race really peaked towards the beginning of the election cycle, and like I just haven't seen anything from it. Fundraising, Rand Paul doesn't seem threatened by his campaign. He doesn't really seem to be having to do as much campaigning. Republicans have done pretty well. I mean, Democrats have done pretty well at shooting themselves in the foot in Kentucky over the past 2 decades, and Republicans have done pretty well at sort of taking over that state. We saw that this year too with the lower ballot redistricting. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think Charles Booker has any chance. And I don't think Gary Chambers has any chance either, but I certainly think that there's more room. John Kennedy seems to be a little bit more concerned, posting some pretty like stupid ads, things like that. But yeah, I still think Democrats are going to win both races by like double digits. But.
How about the Maggie Hassan race in New Hampshire?
So Republicans pretty much pulled out of that race the entire cycle, and even Kristen New, like last month, was like, "I'm so glad Republicans. I didn't get pressure to run for this race because Republicans just lost, right?" And I agree with that. Republicans are starting to actually They announced that they were going to start putting money into Don Bolduc's campaign. Then again, he did basically say, I can't even remember. He had this really bad gaffe on abortions during their debate. And it seemed to be, I like here in Mass, like I get attack ads for Bolduc. I'm on the board from Hassan about his questions on abortion. And I'm pretty sure that that's like, if Republicans started to get any chance there again, I think that his poor debate performance, his poor skills or lack thereof as a candidate, Maggie Hassan being pretty well overall in her election skills, right? She unseated an incumbent narrowly in the past election. I just think she's going to win by a lean margin. Even as the race gets more competitive, I still don't really see her losing that. Her opponent's just not a good candidate.
Okay, I understand. That's interesting. I didn't think that she really had much of a challenge this time.
Yeah, she didn't.
Hearing any news about that?
Yeah, no one was really looking at the race for a while, and people are starting to say it's more competitive because Republicans said they were going to spend on it, and because the past 3 polls have shown it as a competitive race. But one of those polls was done by Trafalgar, which is a very right-wing pollster that was sponsored by the Daily Wire for that poll. So just like throw that out of existence. And one of the other ones is Coefficient, which is this like really poor polling company in terms of some of their polls. In the past, they have a C rating from 538, which pretty bad. And some of their other polls this year have certainly been outliers. So, I mean, yeah.
Okay, so that leaves what? Ron Johnson's race in Wisconsin with Barnes, Mandela Barnes. Where do you think that one stands right now?
I mean, same as last week. I think maybe Mandela Barnes can bounce back a little bit. I've seen some people saying that. At this point, though, I'm not seeing anything really change in that state. Polling's not showing that much is changing. Republicans.
Okay, so what did Barnes do wrong in that campaign? Like at one point he had a very good chance.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a loaded question that that race would certainly be one I need to do more research on. But generally what I've seen come out of this is a very contentious Democratic primary that I think hurt things. The fact that people don't want you to just complain, no matter how bad Ron Johnson is. And he's pretty bad even for a Republican senator, right?
Yeah, I thought he was awful.
A coherent message isn't just bash our Republican opponent and hope that that's going to convince independents or whatever to come out and vote for us. And that seemed to be a big part of the Democratic message for quite a long period of time in the election, even now. And in a swing state like Wisconsin, maybe that doesn't go over well. Maybe they're more focused on policy or more focused on what you're going to do to stop inflation or recession than
or
they
maybe
are
the war, what you're
like,
going to do to stop
yeah,
it.
yeah, exactly. Then hearing you complain about why your Republican opponent is a bad guy, like, and I don't know. I think Ron Johnson has more experience campaigning. He's a pretty good campaigner, all things considered. In terms of the state, he knows the state well. And yeah, I mean that those would be my sort of reasons for why I don't really think Wisconsin is winnable for Democrats this year, or why I think Mandela Barnes has sort of slid out of favor. And he too has had statements that haven't always gone over well, or old tweets that have resurfaced that Ron Johnson and the Republicans have utilized pretty effectively in terms of painting him as maybe not as the strongest or most serious senator. So yeah.
Okay, so of course I've left for last in terms of the Senate the Arizona race. How serious is the challenge, of Blake Master?
Yeah, so two things. There's also the Nevada race, but in terms of Arizona, that race the race is becoming more competitive according to polls. I still don't think there's really any shot for like Mark Kelly to lose. It's certainly potential. There's potential there for it to happen. His support, Mark Kelly's support, has actually remained incredibly solid over the past month. He's just literally been at like 48% pretty much every single poll.
So he's not losing support.
So he's not losing support, but it did
Blake
seem
Masters is gaining.
Yeah, it has seemed over the past 3 weeks or so that Blake Masters, for whatever reason, a lot of the undecideds are coming out in support of Blake Masters. He's gotten about a 3% gain in the polls, so that brings the race from a 6-7% lead for Mark Kelly to about a 2 to 3% lead on average.
But you think he can hold on?
I mean, I think he can hold on. Certainly, if he for some reason hasn't hit a ceiling, which I don't think, right? All that would need to happen is that of the 7% or so of undecided voters, like a third of them come out and support Mark Kelly, which I think is reasonable. And then at least looking just at the numbers on the polls, that would be enough for him. And certainly I think he can do better than that. And Blake Masters really isn't a great campaigner or a great candidate. And also I should say that the past week or two of polls haven't really been from the greatest polling companies. They've been from a lot of the more mediocre polling companies with low likely voter turnout. So 500, the two of the polls published, 2 of the 4 polls published, or 3 of the 4 polls published in the past couple days have had less than 1,000 voters for a statewide race, especially in a fairly big state like Arizona. That's not the most representative sample sizes either. So
okay, so some of the I should I guess first talk about Catherine Cortez Masto.
Yeah, I mean that race I think is the key for Democrats, other than Pennsylvania and Georgia. I think, in all likelihood, Democrats are going to win Arizona. They're very probably going to win Georgia. And I would still, if I had to bet on it, bet that they're going to win Pennsylvania, right? And that gets them the 50 that they need to hold the Senate. And that's why I think overall it's looking good for Democrats in the Senate. That being said, if they want to be able to bridge out and maybe get some more votes done, they need 50 to 52 votes, at least for some things, right? 51 to 52. And Catherine Mastos would be that 51st, or in the odds that Georgia or Pennsylvania end up going to Republicans. Her race is incredibly important for keeping the majority for Democrats. That being said, she's not doing that great polling wise. Fundraising did get better, and her polling lead has stopped. So what was basically happening was that Laxalt, her opponent, was getting a lot of support in the polls, while she was having some waning in the polls from maybe not running that strong of a campaign and getting that much energy or fundraising out, right? Or like ads out, I mean. And so Laxalt was getting a lot of that momentum in the past month and a half and starting to do really well, making the race very competitive, or even like in favor of Republicans. That being said, as of a couple of weeks ago, I think Democrats are really starting to realize that if they want to hold on to the Senate, or if they want to hold on to the Senate and be able to ignore Joe Manchin, that they would really need this race, and that Nevada, it is a state that Democrats should be winning. So they were,
Yes.
I think, a lot more press coverage is coming out about the race, a lot more support, a lot of people saying, right, we don't want to lose the only Latina member of Congress or of the Senate, right? And that this is a really important
Identity politics.
Yeah, but I think it's still important, right? Having at least one Hispanic woman in an emergingly Hispanic country, in your Senate. And so I think identity politics isn't always great, but I think that there is a good enough message here for that. Maybe that's a bit more of a personal tangent, but anyway, I think that sort of more momentum for her campaign. I think her campaign's doing better. Like, I don't know if they've had a debate, but I've been looking at some of her ads and stuff, and I think there's a more sound message coming from her than like just not really having a message. And so she's actually gaining more support in the polls now in the same way that he is, but she's starting to a bit more. So the race is still very competitive. It's pretty much a toss-up at this point. I know some people might say tilt Republican. I guess I would maybe say that makes sense. But like, I don't know. It's hard to. It's kind of like the way that somebody said it earlier. Oh yeah, when Steve was talking about the Georgia race, it can be really hard to tell which way it's gonna break in the end.
Yes.
And
that may be true for Nevada also, right?
Yeah, and that's particularly how I feel about Nevada, and that it could end up being like how North Carolina sort of became really, really competitive, even when Democrats were leading for most of the election cycle, became really competitive, and then Republicans won it. Certainly that's possible here, but remains to be seen, yes.
Okay, a couple of more questions. I want to shift over to some of the gubernatorial races now.
Mm-hmm.
Does Beto O'Rourke have any chance in Texas?
No. I mean, I am a lot more focused on federal elections than I am governor's elections, but no. Democrats, I'll say this, Democrats probably have a minutely better chance of flipping the Oklahoma governor race than they do the Texas governor race.
Oh, good.
I just don't see it for Beto. I don't see any way that his campaign is going to be even as competitive as it was in 2018. Greg Abbott's really bad, but it just doesn't seem like people in Texas are getting as energized about this race as they would be, even though Beto's a beloved Democratic figure there. Polls have pretty much shown this race at a high single-digit lead for the entire election cycle. I think right now the polling average is 8 to 9% lead for Republicans, which, given everything Greg Abbott has done, is kind of terrifying. But overall,
it is terrifying. I mean, people freezing.
Yeah, exactly.
Just incredible.
Yeah, but it really just I just don't think his campaign is doing anything to be really competitive.
Okay, the other one I wanted to ask about was the Pennsylvania race.
Mm-hmm.
How strong does Josh Shapiro look?
He's been pretty strong. I mean, pretty much since that primary happened where the Republicans chose Mastriano.
Yeah.
Everyone has kind of known that Democrats were going to win that race. And I really, even when things are changing in the Senate race or changing statewide, I mean, nationally rather, nothing has really shown much movement in the Pennsylvania governor race. I mean, Mastriano still maintains, actually Shapiro, maintains now an 11-point lead from the 9% lead he had
Oh, wow.
a couple weeks ago.
So his lead has grown.
Yeah, his lead just keeps growing, and it seems like people overall know to sort of give up on that race for Republicans. And I will say that I think that sort of hopefully benefits Fetterman. I think the races are very unconnected compared to what statewide races could be quite often. But a lot of support out there for Shapiro could mean a decent amount more support for Fetterman, if that makes sense. Just like in terms of getting Democrats out to vote.
Yes, I think it does make sense. Okay, it makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, so did I overlook anything?
Not really. I mean, I guess it depends on what you want to. Yeah, I don't really think so. I think overall, this election cycle is a lot more volatile place to place and at any given week than some of the past elections we've seen. I think that the media, in some ways, is overhyping Democrats. Certainly, pretending that Democrats have a really strong chance of winning the Ohio Senate race, right, or winning Iowa or whatever, right? But certainly,
Yes, I meant to ask you about Franken.
Franken's not going to win. It was looking for a while like his campaign was starting to do better. Not really. At the same time, though, the House races have actually gotten a bit better for Democrats. Axnay could actually end up holding the 3rd district, and the 1st, in particular the 2nd districts, could end up being more competitive. And people thought the fundraising numbers were really close, a lot closer for Democrats than people thought. And I want to say there was a recent poll in the Senate race that also included House results that showed maybe not actually. Maybe I'm thinking of something else. Never mind. There haven't been many recent ones. Still possible Democrats probably more likely than not lose 2, if not all 3 of those House races, but just that they could be doing better than expected. So if things change this week, we could see Democrats hold or gain in Iowa, but probably unlikely.
Should we do another of these programs focused on the races on Monday night?
Yep.
Or
maybe. I just don't know how much things are going to change. I am pretty much free all Tuesday. If you do want to come on, or want me to come on the show just to talk briefly about it. And then that night.
I have 3 shows I'll be doing on Tuesday.
All right.
With the 9 o'clock show. I'll also have a morning show and maybe another show in the early afternoon.
All right.
Okay. I'm not sure about the times. I keep them flexible.
Right.
For the daytime shows.
Mm-hmm.
I keep the 9 o'clock show for each of the nights of the week.
Mm-hmm.
But I vary the times of the earlier shows. Okay, but there will be those shows.
Mm-hmm.
And I will have the flexibility to have shows either on Monday night, okay, or on Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
So if you'd like to come on, that would be very easy to arrange.
All right.
So why don't we keep in touch on changes that are going on, and also on what things are looking like, on Monday.
Mm-hmm.
And then go from there.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. I think you did a magnificent job in this show.
Thanks.
You were right on top of everything.
Yeah, I'm balancing out the work schedule now that it's been a few weeks. So I think I'm having more time to be able to start putting into politics again. And I don't work this weekend or Tuesday. So I'm pretty much just going to be cranking out election stuff.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, that's terrific. So thank you very much for tonight.
Yeah. Okay.
And I will see you soon. I do want to remind people of a couple of things. In fact, I think I'm going to look at the comments, so that's going to take a little time.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on. I said thanks for having me on. I'm going to go.
It's always a pleasure, Ezra.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Have a great night, guys.
Okay, take care.
Thanks. You too.
Okay, so folks, I'm still here. I'm going to take some of your comments. Okay, I thought Ezra was great, wasn't he? thought he was really great. I see quite a few comments here, and that's good. So I'm going to give them some attention. I want to remind you also, my Patreon account is at patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And my Buy Me a Coffee account is at buymeacoffee.com/Joe.Firestone. So one is _Firestone, and the other one is Firestone. Firecloud says, I wonder if Firecloud comes from California. The best way to empower democracy is to increase the amount of social media censorship. That's an interesting point of view. Okay, I have to think about that. I think in one respect, I would say that perhaps the effect of the government agencies interfering with who gets to say what on social media does not empower democracy. But that's another discussion, I think, for another day. I'd be interested in seeing why you think increasing the amount of social media censorship is likely to empower democracy. Steve Wolprin said Ezra is very knowledgeable, but I think he's wrong. Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't see your comment. I would have liked to have asked him about Caruso and Villanueva and Kenneth Mejia, and especially Angelica, of course. I really want to know how she's doing. Steve Wolfbrand says, but Wendy Carrillo. Steve says he sees a red tsunami. Kay said, stop being a bummer, Steve. And Dolores Pierce says, hi, Steve. Look, folks, Steve tells it like he thinks, okay, it is. We should not be taking it as a bummer. As we have our own ideas as to why Steve is wrong, and so, we can exchange ideas. And Firecloud says, the more we can shut down free speech, the more democracy will be empowered. Oh, I see. Kay says, how about Ryan in Ohio? Of course, we went over Ryan in some detail. I have hopes for Ryan in part based on the Politico article and the way, he seemed to be running the campaign. But I think that Ezra has a better grasp than I have of important facts of the campaign, specifically the polling across the board, the fundraising, what the patterns are there. Also, the success, of is it J.C. Vance or J.D. Vance? I always forget. The political article really mentioned the cultural differences that J.D. Branch, J.D. Vance really is not so consistent, with the Ohio cultural values, let's say, as Tim Ryan is. Okay, I thought that was an important point, of the Politico article. I think from an Ohio point of view, Tim Ryan is really a regular guy, and J.D. Vance is a refugee from Silicon Valley. And so I think it is really hard to tell which way this will break. the Tim Ryan contest. Hey, Shane, how you doing? And Kay says, hi, Shane. Shane says, hey, Kay. Has Ezra seen Breaking Point's take on this? You mean on the Ohio race? I don't know. I hadn't seen Breaking Point's take on that. I watch Breaking Points a lot. I just happened to miss that one. I guess I was too busy watching all the news from the war, which is getting pretty good coverage from people on the internet. Kay said, wish North Carolina would go blue again. Love to go back there someday. And Kay says, GOP have ruined North Carolina. Well, they ruined Kansas also, didn't they? Kay says, all the newer residents have been the big change in that. Kay says, North Carolina is the new Florida. And Dolores says, hi, Shane. Steve says, well, it's Texas. And Kay says, many Texas votes like Bebeto too. I agree, many do, but of course, the many who like him have to be more than the many who like Greg Abbott. That's evidently a bit of a problem. Steve Wolfbrand says, thank you. Is that a thank you to me, Steve? I don't know. But Kay says, thank you, Ezra. Oh, I see. Everybody's thanking Ezra. Okay. Thank you, folks. So that's me for tonight. I'll be back tomorrow with some other shows. There will be many interesting ones. I will be off on Saturday and Sunday, but I'll be back on Monday talking about a lot of interesting things then. So I hope to see you all then. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm very happy about how this particular program went. I thought it was just very good in its overall coverage, and that Ezra did a terrific job. So Steve says goodbye and good night and night all. Oh, that was Kay who said night all. Have a good night, Joe. Thank you, Kay. I certainly will. You have a good night too. Also, Dolores, thank you, everyone, and good night. And she leaves, I guess, a sleep icon, which I can't really see that well. Steve says, sleep tight. It's a little early for us to go to sleep. We won't be going to sleep. We go to sleep fairly late, though recently it hasn't been as late as usual because we're trying to change the schedule, to adapt to the new schedule. And that involves my getting up early so I can prepare for the morning stream and the afternoon stream. So that's changed things a little for us. Anyway, I'm going to end the broadcast now and wish you all a wonderful night. And hopefully I'll see you tomorrow and Monday and Tuesday and going forward. Thanks a lot.